Dude just showed me. I wasn't really paying attention. And I think it was on. You just turned it off. No, I just turned it off. There we go.
Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Jim Stevens, the chair of architecture here at Lawrence Tech, and welcome to the people who are joining us remotely. This is our final lecture for the fall semester. And tonight we're going to hear from Dr. Dale Gyure. My first year teaching at Lawrence Tech, which was hard to believe, but a decade ago, in one of the very first meetings, faculty meetings, somebody who's no longer here stood up and said, I have a trip to Greece, and we have one free spot left if a faculty wants to go. And of course, the meeting ended, and I'm like jumping over tables and elbowing people to put my name on the list. And then I found out the other faculty member was Dr. Gyure, and I remember thinking, oh no.
Nice.
I'm like an assistant professor. Here's this tenured guy, and he's an historian. I'm like, oh God. But what ended up happening is we sat at the back of the bus the whole time and shared a lot of laughs, and he actually was my tour guide of Greece. And I learned a lot, and I gained a colleague and a friend that trip, and that's still true today. So I'm very excited about this lecture, and to list his long accomplishments. He's a professor and the associate chair now of architecture, I'm happy to say, at Lawrence Tech. And he earned his PhD in architectural history from the University of Virginia, and a JD from Indiana University, and a BS in psychology from Ball State University. So he can be your psychiatrist, your lawyer, and your historian. Amazing. And Dr. Gyure's research focuses on American and modern architecture of the 19th and 20th century. He has published 3 books to date: Frank Lloyd Wright's Florida Southern College and the Chicago Schoolhouse from 1856 to 2006, High School Architecture and Educational Reform, 2011, and the content of tonight's lecture, the new book on Yamasaki, Humanist Architecture for the Modernist World. He has also written articles and reviews for Annex, CoAD, Chicago History, History of Education Quarterly, Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, Oculus, and the Winthrop Portfolio. And his 4th book, yes, he has another one coming out, or he's finishing now that this one's done, The Schoolroom, A Social History of Teaching and Learning. And it will be published next year, so we expect you back next year for another lecture on that book. Dr. Gyure has served on the boards of directors of the Society of Architectural Historians, the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy, and Tacomano in Michigan, and is a member of the Michigan Historic Preservation Review Board. So that's the long list of qualifications. I won't take up any more of his time. I'm excited about the lecture. Welcome, Dr. Gyure.
Thanks, Jim. Can everybody hear me okay? Does it sound good? Okay. So tell me if I'm too loud, because I'm used to projecting out into A200 without a microphone, so I don't want to blast anybody that's, all those people that are watching on YouTube right now. So first I want to thank Dean Daubin for giving me the opportunity to present my work. I have spent the better part of the last 8 years researching and writing about Minoru Yamasaki, and my book just came out this week, and I'm very excited about it, and it's always good fun to be able to present this kind of information for people. My challenge today will be, I think, twofold. This is my 3rd lecture today, so my voice hopefully will hold out. I think it feels good. I'm strong. And the other challenge is to keep it within a reasonable time, so hopefully I won't ramble on too long about this. What I wanted to do today is a little different from what I normally do. When I present to public audiences, I just do the history of Yamasaki and his architecture. And I decided, since you guys are more architecturally sophisticated, I would focus in a little bit more on a specific topic. And then if you're curious about Yamasaki and want to learn more, you can check out the book, which just came out this week, available on Amazon. And yes. And so I always have to begin with this, AIA credits. I don't think I have to read that. I did prepare this. We're supposed to put learning objectives down, so if you're here for AIA credit, this is what you'll learn out of this lecture, hopefully. Okay, so I want to do this in two parts. The first part is going to be an overview of Yamasaki's career, but I'm going to try to keep it brief. And then I want to spend the second part talking about Yamasaki and humanism and architecture, which when I started to investigate his career, I was really interested in trying to understand why it was that he described himself as a humanist architect. Because from my training and background, I understood humanism to be an aspect of the Italian Renaissance architects, but I didn't realize that it had carried on into the 20th century so much, and I was actually pretty surprised at how much it did, and at how often he referenced himself as being a humanist architect. So in the second part, I want to kind of look at humanism and architecture in the 20th century and then put Yamasaki into that context. So to begin with, Minoru Yamasaki was an American architect. He was born in Seattle in 1912. His parents were Japanese immigrants. He grew up in Seattle and attended the University of Washington, graduated from the architecture program in the early 1930s. In the early years of the economic Great Depression, he moved to New York City to try to find a job and spent about 15 years kicking around at different architectural jobs in New York. In the meantime, for a long time, his standard source of income was that he was wrapping dishes for a China company, a Chinaware company. And that kept him employed while he tried to find work with various firms. And he was able to find firms or work with some really big firms like Shreve, Lamb and Harmon, who had designed the Empire State Building just a couple years before. He worked for Wallace Harrison with Harrison and Abramovitz. He worked with Raymond Loewy, a famous industrial designer, for a long time. But during all that period, he never really got a chance to do any real individual projects. And so in the late 40s, when a representative from Smith, Hinchman and Grills in Detroit came calling, he was very interested. And Smith, Hinchman and Grills, if you know, is now Smith Group. Even back in the late 40s, it was one of the largest architectural firms, if not the largest firm in the country. And they were interested in upgrading their architectural output. They were a very solid, kind of conservative, traditional firm, but they wanted to move in more of a modernist direction. So unfortunately, one of the great mysteries I still haven't been able to resolve is why they came for Yamasaki, because he didn't really have any outstanding examples of work to show them. And I think it had to do with connections, because Yamasaki got very connected in his New York years. He became best friends with George Nelson, who went on to become an important architect and furniture designer. He was friends with Douglas Haskell, who was the editor of Architectural Forum for quite a while. And so I think it was through the connections that they started to talk to him. But they lured him from New York to Detroit with the offer to become the firm's lead designer. And so he jumped at the opportunity, moved to Detroit, and started to work on projects. His most famous project from that era, and his first really important project, is the Federal Reserve Bank Annex in downtown Detroit, which is still there. It is very much in the international style mode of his early years. It was significant because it was the first steel-framed curtain wall skyscraper building in Detroit, and drew a lot of publicity for that. But the problem was that even as he was designing this and other commissions in the area, he was not allowed to have contact with clients. The way Smith Hinchman was set up was that only partners communicated with clients. So he was not a partner, but even though he was the lead designer in the firm, if he wanted to make changes in a project, he had to communicate with the client through a partner. And he thought that was just ridiculous. And so sort of right from the start, I think the writing was on the wall for him to leave. And after a few years, Smith Hinchman, he did leave. He took off with two other people who worked there and formed a small firm. One was George Helmuth, an architect from St. Louis, who had been with the firm for about 5 years or so, I think, before Yamasaki started. And I'm pretty sure he's the guy that recruited Yamasaki from New York. And the other partner was Joseph Lineweber, who was an older architect who was in fact a full partner at Smith Hinchman and Grills. And was the one who had the most to lose, I think, by forming this new firm. But they did it. They went off in 1949 and started their own firm, which confusingly was actually two firms. I think they realized early on that Helmuth had some really good connections in St. Louis that they didn't want to lose. He'd grown up there. His father had been an architect there, and he'd worked for the city government for a while. And so in St. Louis, they were known as Helmuth, Yamasaki, and Lineweber. And in Detroit, the office was known as Lineweber, Yamasaki, and Helmuth. It took me a long time to figure out during the research. It was very confusing. But in both cases, Yamasaki was in the middle, and he was the lead designer for this group as well, which meant that he was doing a lot of traveling right off the bat between St. Louis and Detroit, and that would end up becoming a problem for him. In the early days, he very much worked in a Misesian mode, as he said. Mies van der Rohe was his idol. He very much appreciated Mies's approach to architecture and the idea that architecture should be based on technological advances and that architectural experimentation should incorporate the latest technology. And of course that, if you know about Mies, the structure is really what's the word? After 3 lectures today, I can't think of it. The essence of an architectural design. Mies was always looking for ways to exploit the idea that now in the 20th century we no longer had to use load-bearing walls, and what did that mean for walls and structure in general. And so as you can see on the upper left is IIT from Mies, and the other 3 are Yamasaki doing his best Mies van der Rohe imitation. As the firm grew, they got more and more projects in St. Louis and Detroit. In St. Louis, they tended to get a lot of public housing projects and a few government buildings, mainly through the connections of Helmuth. In Detroit, they tended to focus on school buildings and houses, but mostly schools, and that's what paid the bills for quite a few years. The first commission that really brought Yamasaki to the attention of the architectural world was the Lambert St. Louis Airport, which he got through Helmuth, Yamasaki, and Lineweber, starting in 1951. It ended up being a pretty interesting design for the time. In the early 50s, there wasn't a lot of this kind of design going on. It was really one of the first thin shell concrete vaulted structures in the United States, along with a exhibition pavilion in North Carolina that Jim certainly knows, and Eero Saarinen's MIT Kresge Auditorium, which was going up at just about the same time. Those were the first 3 really structurally innovative buildings in the United States. And it got him a lot of publicity, as I said. He sort of based it on the idea of an updated Roman bathhouse with the vaults, and he wanted to give it this sort of soaring quality. And it was very well received. It received an AIA Honor Award in 1956, which was his first. It got extensive coverage in the journals. And as I said, this is what brought him to the attention of the architectural world. And at the start, he was seen as a really high-end technological guy, a guy who was pushing the boundaries of structure and architecture. After that, they continued to do work, but Yamasaki's health began to fail as he kept commuting, flying back and forth between St. Louis and Detroit constantly and he was the lead designer, so his projects were going on in both places. Took a toll on his health. In late 1953, he cracked in the sense that he had to be admitted to the hospital with what was described as surgery to remove 2/3 of his stomach because of bleeding ulcers. And the doctors told him he had to take a rest after that or else he was going to kill himself. And so he decided to take that opportunity to do some traveling, to see the world and to look at all the architecture that he'd been reading about for years and had admired from a distance. So he spent months on a world tour. He went to Italy, he went to France, he went to Pakistan, he went to India, he went to Thailand. He ended up in Japan, which is important for a reason I'll mention in a minute. But this really changed his life. It was almost like a movie, you know, where you see Somebody has this life-altering event, and then everything is different afterwards. And that's always kind of suspect in fiction, but in real life, it seems like it happened to Yamasaki. It opened his eyes to a new way of thinking about design. He never abandoned his interest in technology and architecture, but after his travels, he started to try to temper that with more of a concern for people, and more of a concern for emotions, and much more of a concern for historical architecture and trying to learn lessons from it. One of the things that he would, for the rest of his life, talk about was the silhouette against the sky. It was one of his standard quotes. He loved the image of the building against the bright sun in the background, and that largely came from the Taj Mahal, which was, along with St. Mark's Piazza in Venice, his two favorite architectural constructions of all time, and they're the ones that he would talk about over and over again. So he came back to the United States with a new orientation, determined to try to create a new kind of architecture that wasn't so Misesian and that opened things up a little bit more, that explored historical references, that tried to create more human, better, pleasant experiences. That was awkward. More pleasant experiences for the users and the viewers. And the reason he ended up in Japan was because just before he went on the trip, the firm, and I'm still not sure which firm it was, but it was the three guys in some variation, was commissioned to do the United States consulate in Kobe, Japan. And a consulate is like a step down from an embassy. Embassy is where the ambassador lives. A consulate is where you go if you have, need to get your passport updated or something like that. But the United States was in the process of opening embassies and consulates all over the world, and they were selecting architectural firms as part of that program who could best represent America and our alleged advances in modern architecture to the rest of the world. So he got to do this one in the country of his people. He'd been to Japan as a teenager and spent about a month there, but at that time he wasn't really interested in architecture. And so when he went back, it was a totally different experience, and he tried to incorporate his new love of Japanese architecture into the project. And it ends up being a kind of a modernist box updated with fiberglass shoji screens and other references to traditional Japanese architecture. You can see the garden behind the building. And again, this was very, very well received by the architectural press. And before it was finished, the firm entered the competition to design the London Embassy, which was also part of this project. And they made it to the final three, which was Yamasaki and his firm, Eero Saarinen and Edward Durrell Stone. In the end, Saarinen's project was chosen, and that's what was built in London. But a lot of people felt that Yamasaki's project was actually better and more suited to the environment, the surrounding environment, that he should have won. So he lost that, but it lifted his status in the architectural world significantly. But the project that really shows the best influence or impact of his world travels was the Mcgregor Conference Center at Wayne State, which he started right about the same time, and which really is his masterpiece. It's the best building that he ever did. It's the most recognized building that he ever did. And it's the first time that he really incorporated a lot of the things that he'd seen on his travels and a lot of the ideas. So instead of being a Misesian box like a lot of his earlier work, it's a modernist reference to a lot of historical types of architecture. There's Gothic in here in terms of the kind of soaring quality. A lot of people have compared that central space to a nave in a Gothic cathedral. There's a kind of a classical balance and symmetry to it. There's the use on the sides, which you can't really see in this photo, of screens, which is an idea that he really learned about and appreciated from Islamic architecture and the mashrabiyah screens that he saw in Pakistan. The Japanese garden, the serene place to get away from the hustle and bustle of the world surrounding the building. It's kind of everything that he saw on his trip he added into the base, which was that Misesian foundation. This was also well received. Won the AIA Honor Award in 1959, and in fact 2 years ago it was named as a National Historic Landmark. And by the way, the upper right-hand photograph, the building you're looking directly at, is Yamasaki's education building at Wayne State, which he did just a couple of years later. And it was really his first exploration of precast concrete. And it's very much based on some of the Islamic architecture that he saw in Pakistan and the Doge's Palace in Venice. And you really start to see in the mid-50s and late 50s how all these influences from the places he saw start to come in. But he didn't abandon the sort of standard Miesian steel and glass box. So at the same time, he was designing what was, I think, my favorite Yamasaki building in its original incarnation, not now, if you've seen it recently, over on 8 Mile, is the Reynolds Metals Regional Sales Office, which was essentially a transparent box with an aluminum screen around it. Very, very interesting for the time, very open, very much trying to unite some of the ornamentation ideas that he had seen around the world with his technological Miesian leanings. In fact, this project was a commission from the Reynolds Metals Regional, or the Reynolds Aluminum Company, to display their products. They were trying to make inroads into the Detroit auto world, and this was going to be a showpiece for aluminum and what it could do. And so they told him, use aluminum as much as you can, and he did. And the key element are those rings, the screen of aluminum rings that surround the box, which are another adaptation of the Islamic Mashrabiya screens that he saw on his travels. He did his first skyscraper in 1958, downtown Detroit, the Michigan Consolidated Gas Company, which is now One Woodward. And he thought that it would be an opportunity for him to rethink the tall building. He didn't want to just do what other people were doing. He wanted to create a new image for tall buildings, one that was more vertical and aspirational, as he called it. He was also beginning to explore precast concrete, so he wanted to see how concrete could be brought into the skyscraper design world. And so what you have here essentially is a steel and glass skyscraper with a concrete screen laid over it. Again, the interest in screens that he became so enamored of on his world tours. He did an airport in Saudi Arabia in the early 1960s, which won him another AIA Honor Award, where he tried to infuse local regional traditions into the designs. This is a time when the Middle East was just starting to have modern architecture built, mostly by Western European architects, but there were some Americans working there as well. And so it's seen as kind of a wide open place for designing it. Everybody was kind of competing to determine what should be the Islamic or Arabic variation or version of modern architecture. And Yamasaki decided that he was going to look at traditional ornamental patterns in Islamic art and try to translate that somehow to a building. And there are echoes of that in this one as well, which is a Jewish synagogue that he did north of Chicago at about the same time, the North Shore Congregation Synagogue, which is one of my favorite buildings and is a really wonderful kind of exploration of light and again, what can be done with precast concrete. You know, we're kind of, we've seen a lot of this sort of thing, or a lot of explorations with concrete in our time, but in 1959, 1960, it was still considered to be a pretty new material. And people were still trying to figure out what it could and couldn't do and how they could incorporate it into their designs. And you can see here, there are some kind of Islamic type arches and other references to some historical aspects, but this is a little bit more abstract than some of the other work. And about this time, he's hired by the government to create a science pavilion for the Seattle World's Fair in 1962. The US government decided that their exhibit at the World's Fair was going to emphasize science and our advances in science, and this is just before the space race begins, but after the Sputnik satellite was launched by the Russians, which scared the heck out of everybody in the United States government and the American academic community, because it was seen as a failure of the American educational system, that the Russians had beat us into space. And so it ended up, you know, there was a serious reworking of the educational goals in America to try to emphasize science and math, which sounds awfully familiar, I think. This was widely praised, and in fact, this was the first Yamasaki building that really attracted a lot of public attention, not just because it was at the World's Fair, but it was publicized in Look magazine and Life magazine and Time magazine and other popular venues. But maybe more important than that, it attracted the attention of a representative of the Port Authority of New York, who at the time was involved in the beginning of planning what was intended to be the world's largest building in New York City. And on the basis of his regard for Yamasaki's Science Pavilion, Yamasaki was invited to enter a competition with a number of other architects to design the World Trade Center. And his chief rivals in that competition were Walter Gropius and Philip Johnson. He ended up winning in large part because he seemed to demonstrate a mixture of technological acuity with a regard for human beings and the psychological aspects of architecture. And so he wins the commission. The project starts in 1962. It takes a long time. He goes through hundreds of schemes trying to figure out how to do this. The famous story is that when they send him the original offer letter to enter the competition, they put a figure in there as to what the amount of square footage was for the proposed building, and I don't want to cite it because I can't remember it accurately, but it was huge, right? And he thought it was a typo. So everybody in the office is like saying, oh, this will be great, but we need to contact them to verify how big it's supposed to be, and it turns out they were correct. And so this small firm suddenly was engaged in the project to design the world's largest structure. So he went through all these different variations. He tried like 10 different towers and 5s and different groupings, came up with the notion of the Twin Towers, and construction proceeded from there. But in the course of that, the tide turned against Yamasaki, and this is really the high watermark of his career. Because when the first models and drawings were unveiled in 1964, they were universally praised by the architectural community as being just really wonderful and something special and a new direction in skyscraper design. And then 2 years later, when he revealed or unveiled version 2, which was only slightly changed, the critics turned on him. Particularly Ada Louise Huxtable from the New York Times, who had championed his work in the past. And from that point on, they savaged him. And they said it was just too big, it was a behemoth, it was a gaudy, crass monument to capitalism and all these other things. Huxtable called it the world's biggest, daintiest building, or something like that. And implying, and I think she's correct actually, what worked for him on a small scale didn't work on a big scale, and that's essentially what he ended up doing at the World Trade Center. It was an overblown version of his architecture, and it wasn't his best design. And because of the backlash, the critical backlash that came after that, and a lot of it was just people who were unhappy because a whole neighborhood was torn down to make this, and because they loved the Empire State Building so much, and this was going to be taller. There's a lot of things that enter into the criticism. But as a result of the World Trade Center, two things happen in his career. One is that he becomes known as a skyscraper architect, even though that was only his third skyscraper. The first had, and they all happened within a 3-year period. So there was the one Woodward building in Detroit, and then just before he got the offer to join the World Trade Center competition, he started working on the IBM building in Seattle, which, as a matter of fact, is the one at the bottom here. So that's the first thing that happens, and for the rest of his career, he becomes known really as a skyscraper architect. And you can see here, he worked on variations of that World Trade Center kind of motif. I won't get into it, but one of the things that he and his team of engineers started to do was to create skyscrapers the way they used to back in the 19th century, and that is with load-bearing walls. But they changed it so that instead of thick load-bearing walls, the weight of these buildings is carried by very thin strips on the outside, which left the interior open. The other thing that happens as a result of the World Trade Center is that his reputation is damaged significantly. And then in 1972, it gets worse with the very public destruction of the Pruitt-Igoe apartment complex in St. Louis, which was dynamited in a very public event, and the architects were scapegoated. And it was a much larger problem than architectural design, as we're in the past few years in particular, there's been an entire industry dedicated to the Pruitt-Igoe myth, which is that poor design was the result, or is why these things never really worked, when in fact the whole idea of gathering all these people together in these poorly constructed buildings because the government wouldn't pay for them as well as socioeconomic problems, just is the real issues behind the disaster. But he got the blame. And so after about the mid-70s, Yamasaki's reputation plummeted. They didn't publish his works anymore in the architectural journals. He was considered to be a has-been. His two most famous projects were disasters, criticized all over the place. And architecture was turning anyway. It was becoming more theoretical. And in the end, by the time we get to the early 1980s, he's seen as a has-been. Somebody who had a moment in the 1960s who emphasized decoration and ornament, and that whole thing was over with, and architecture had moved on to something else. So when he died in 1986, there were some respectful obituaries saying, you know, this man had been something back in the old days, but his day had passed. So that's one of the reasons why I became interested in him and decided to research and write the book, was to try to figure out, you know, how was a guy who was on the cover of Time magazine, who won all these AIA honor awards, who was one of only 2 people to have a solo exhibition at the Architectural League of New York, and the other one was Frank Lloyd Wright. How did he fall so fast and so far? And that's all in here, but that's not the lecture. That's not the lecture I'm going to give tonight. So that's all just set up for what I want to talk about next, which is in the course of researching this, as I said, I came across him referring to himself as a humanist so much. And I was trying to figure out, you know, after reviewing the buildings I just showed you and many others which are quite similar, what does that mean? What did it mean to call yourself a humanist architect in 1960? And it turns out it was much more complicated than I thought it was going to be, and so that's what I want to kind of work through in the second part here. So, starting with the origins of the term, and those of you who are in HDE1, we just went through this a couple weeks ago, right? And it goes back to the Italian Renaissance, in the beginning in the 14th century, which is this Western reorientation towards the classical past and a real change in thought where people begin to talk about human beings and their abilities and achievements, and they start to become dissatisfied with supernatural or religious explanations of the world, and they start to look for human, they start to emphasize human abilities and human values and achievements, and this is the whole notion that man is the center of everything, and that we really need to, well, that was part of it, and the other part was kind of rebirth of interest in the classical literature of the Greeks and Romans before Christianity, which had always celebrated human beings rather than religious explanations. And so the Italian Renaissance humanists kind of spurred an interest among Italian Renaissance architects in going back and revisiting the classical idea about architecture being directly connected to buildings. And just in a nutshell, the Greeks had developed this idea of classical architecture, which basically tried to use architecture to teach people about the orderliness and the interconnections of the universe. And the way they did that was through the human body, because they felt that humans were part of the universe, and so the laws that organized all the universe also organized our bodies and can be read in our bodies. And so they started to measure bodies and find proportions that seemed to relate to each other. And so they developed a whole architecture out of proportional relationships, which therefore demonstrated the hidden rules of the universe. And it created a strong connection between bodies and buildings. Well, that idea lingered in architecture for a couple hundred years, and then the Enlightenment comes in Europe, and those ideas begin to fade away, and other things begin to take their place. But it never really disappeared. It received a new impetus in the 19th century. And that's, so the slide on the left doesn't really fit with what I'm about to say, but I had to show it because I love it. In the 19th century, a group of German art historians decide that they really want to understand what the Italian Renaissance architects were all about with this connection between bodies and buildings. And they thought maybe that was deeper than had been imagined. And so they came up with the notion of what they called Einfühlen, or translated literally from German means in feeling or feeling into. In English we call it empathy, you know, the idea that you can sympathize with someone else, that there's some kind of mental connection between people. That's sort of a mystical, magical thing, but it definitely exists. And so these German art theorists came up with the notion that that's what the Renaissance architects were really up to, that this body-building connection was really based on a psychological connection between human beings and the things that they saw. And that somehow looking at certain forms or shapes or lines or configurations stimulated something in our brains so that we felt sympathy, in a way, with the buildings that we're looking at. In the early 1900s, Geoffrey Scott wrote a book. He was not an architect, in fact, but he was sort of an art critic, art writer. But he became really interested in this whole topic, and he wrote a book called The Architecture of Humanism, where he tried to explain these ideas for a 20th century modern audience. And so he said things like, in certain situations, we transcribe ourselves into terms of architecture. In others, we transcribe architecture into terms of ourselves. This is the humanism of architecture. The tendency to project the image of our functions into concrete forms is the basis for architecture of creative design. So he's building on this notion of empathy, that there's some psychological connection. When we see things, some configuration, it just strikes us in our mind, and automatically there's a psychological connection between us and the building. So for most of the 20th century before World War II, this is how they understood humanism, either as the old Renaissance idea of utilizing proportions derived from the human body to create buildings, or maybe digging in a little deeper and getting into the empathetic connection that Scott had talked about. After World War II, though, there's a shift in the way that people talk about and think about humanism and architecture. And it particularly begins to appear in the late 1940s, and the word or term humanism starts to show up a lot more frequently than I thought it would. So for example, in 1949, Rudolf Wittkower, a German art historian, publishes The Architectural Principles in the Age of Humanism, which is a book that reinforces the traditional body-building correspondence from the Italian Renaissance. But it's a more historically grounded study than Scott's was. Scott's was more of a theoretical piece, and Wittkower was a scholar, and he was trying to educate really a 20th century audience on the beauty of Renaissance design, particularly of Palladio, Andrea Palladio, which was all done through proportions, bilateral symmetry, and other notions which involved looking at the body and translating it to architecture. But at the same time, people like Le Corbusier are interested in proportional systems, and this is when he creates the modulor, which is an attempt to create a new modern proportional system that's somewhat similar to the Italian Renaissance, but is updated with everything but the kitchen sink. I mean, the Fibonacci series is in here, and the golden section, and everything that you can imagine. But the bottom line is that he was interested in this idea of connections between bodies and buildings. But other commentators started to use the term humanism in a different way, in a way that was more about counteracting what they saw as the overemphasis on functionalism and rationalism in the international style design that was dominating architecture in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So for instance, Louis Mumford, who was a very prominent architectural commentator at the time, had a column in the New Yorker called Skyline, where he wrote about urban and architectural problems. In 1947, writes a column that is dedicated to talking about humanism in architecture, in which he says the main problem of architecture today is to reconcile the universal and the regional, the mechanical and the human. And that he said in the article, architecture should serve human psychological and physical and emotional needs, and the international style doesn't do it. The international style is more interested in designing for function or exploring technological developments, and they're forgetting about people. And so Mumford was trying to reorient people, or reorient architects towards what he thought was more important. And in particular, I showed these two images at the bottom. He tried to get people to pay attention to what he called the Bay Region style, which was the work of architects in San Francisco, William Worcester and Bernard Maybeck, who were using natural materials and human scale and references to regional vernacular traditions to create a new and different kind of modernism. And at the same time, in the 40s, Alvar Aalto is rising to prominence, and he is just blatantly writing and talking about humanist architecture. He writes an article in 1948, for instance, called The Humanizing of Architecture, where he says its purpose is to bring the material world into harmony with human life. And again, he says we need to prioritize human needs and desires, human psychological experiences and emotions, and not just functional plans and structural innovations. And again, it's a reaction against that international style dominance. And in many ways, the person who's most associated with humanism and architecture in the post-war world is Vincent Scully, who is an architectural historian at Yale University, who in 1957 published a book called Modern Architecture, where he kind of reintroduces the term, but in a new way. Humanism and architecture, for him, is an extension of Scott's idea of empathy, the relationship, the mysterious psychological relationship or connection that we have with a building. Now, this is part of a larger project where he's challenging the standard interpretation of modernist architecture at the time, which came from Siegfried Gideon, who wrote a book called Space, Time, and Architecture, which surmised that the roots of modernist thinking go back to the Romans. They're the first people to really concentrate on interiors. And so Gideon said that's really the genesis of what modern architecture would become later on. Scully thought that was wrong. He wanted to go back to the Greeks because he felt that in addition to that interior emphasis being important, what was missing in Gideon's interpretation was an emphasis on the building as an object, a sculptural, three-dimensional object. And so in this piece, Modern Architecture, he urges architects to return to the notion of empathy, the psychological connection. And he says things like, we empathetically experience upright bodies in terms of our own. This, he's trying to relate, he says there's this incredible mysterious connection that when we see the right kind of building, it strikes a chord in us, and we kind of relate to it as a person. He talks about upright bodies over and over again. He talks about characteristics of architecture like dynamism, which are also found in human beings. And it's all kind of vague, but at the same time, he is talking about making that connection, that psychological connection, in a sort of Scott-like experience. But at the same time, he added a new wrinkle, which was he brought the Cold War context into it. So for Scully, there was two aspects of humanism and architecture. One was empathy, the other was democracy. He called humanist architecture the architecture of democracy. And his argument was that democracy is the best political system that's ever been invented because it takes into account individual freedom, free expression, and we need to find an architectural correlation to that. And that would be a humanist architecture. And so he and others started to talk about architecture in the same way that people were talking about abstract expressionist painting in the 1950s and jazz music. They were promoted as American art forms that grew out of our unique cultural situation where we had freedom and we had free expression. And only in a place like that, only in a culture like that, could these kinds of art forms evolve. And they're very free art forms without rules, and well, they have rules, but without the constraints of tradition. So Scully has this sort of odd new interpretation of humanism and architecture, which involves politics and the Cold War, as well as more traditional notions of empathy and connections between body and building. So it's during this time that Yamasaki starts to identify himself as a humanist. And in 1960, he gives a lecture in London to the Royal Institute of British Architects, which he entitles A Humanist Architecture. And there, for the first time, he kind of lays out what he means when he's talking about that. And his principles are, and he lists these in his talk, architecture's goals should be to enhance the enjoyment of life through beauty and delight, to be uplifting so that we can reflect the nobility to which man aspires, to give order and through order a background of serenity for the complexity of modern life, To be truthful, by which he means buildings should have clarity of structure and should show that structural honesty, as I teach my students. To have a full understanding of and a fidelity to technology that was seen by Yamasaki and others as the whole reason for modern architecture. The zeitgeist had changed, technology had given us new materials and new ways of building to play with, and it was your responsibility as a modernist to explore those avenues. To be in scale with man so that at all times he's secure and happy in his environment and intimately related to it. Wait a minute. Yeah, that's the last one. Okay. Sorry, I thought there was another one. So I looked at this and I thought, well, this is interesting. You know, some of it seems to relate to what I've been talking about, but some of it doesn't. And quite a bit of it seems more oriented towards just mainstream modernism. And Mies van der Rohe might fulfill some of these categories or goals. So I started to look at the culture to try to understand maybe, you know, what these guys were talking about in a non-architectural way. Because, as we know, and as you learn in my classes, culture influences architecture. There's no getting around it. So I wasn't surprised to find quite a bit of talk about humanism out there in the culture after World War II. And something to remember is, this is right after World War II. And the high-tech slaughter and destruction, followed by the Cold War and the threat of nuclear annihilation, was on people's minds. This was the first generation of human beings who had to live with the threat of annihilation from nuclear war, and it had an effect on them. All throughout Western culture, in the 1950s, there's a resurgent interest in humanism as a way to recuperate man's moral standing. There was a feeling that something had been lost in World War II. The destruction of it was just almost unimaginable, and that we really need to get a handle on ourselves and to come together as people, or else disaster was going to happen. And don't forget that the war was possible in large part because of technological advances. So technology got a bad name after World War II, and a lot of people were sort of fearful of it because of that. So you can see it in places like a 1955 exhibition at the MoMA, Museum of Modern Art in New York, called The Family of Man, which was an exhibit of over 500 photographs by international photographers of people just doing everyday things. And the goal was to promote a new humanism around the world, a feeling of peace and brotherhood, to emphasize our connections and our shared humanity, so that maybe if we all got together and understood each other and worked together, we could avoid things like World War II in the future. This turned out to be the most successful MoMA show of the 1950s, and it toured around the world for 7 years under the auspices of the United States Information Agency. Or the 1958 World's Fair in Brussels, which was the first World's Fair held after World War II. The theme was a worldview, a new humanism. And in their promotional materials, they talked about a rehumanization of the modern world. And they said things like, the goal of the fair is to promote or to sound a note of hope that man on the threshold of the atomic age may find a better means of achieving human understanding and peace. So this stuff is out there. It's out there in the culture. Humanism is a word that people are familiar with. It seems to have, in the larger culture, ramifications coming from World War II and the notion of we'd all better get together or we're all going to disappear if things get bad. But it also represents how vital the term humanism was to post-war life, so it's not surprising that finds its way into architecture as well. So, in summary then, looking at the architectural uses of humanism in the 20th century up to this point, I felt that I could categorize them into 4 different groups in general. First, there's a body-building humanism, which is sort of the original notion of it, going back to the Italian Renaissance. The idea of recognizing the correspondence between human bodies and buildings from classical architecture, epitomized by the Italian Renaissance, in terms of using ideas that you can find in the body, like proportional relationships, bilateral symmetry, etc., and then inscribing them into buildings. And this is what we saw in Vitcover and Corbusier, for instance. Then there's the empathetic humanism, demonstrated by Geoffrey Scott and Vincent Scully, which focuses on the psychological correlation between the human mind and the building as a physical object. That magical, mystical connection where we'll sometimes look at a building and it just seems right, and we almost treat it like a human being. In fact, Scully would say we do treat it as a human being. Third, the democratic humanism, which Scully represents mainly, and I'm not sure anybody really followed him on this, but it's about humanism as a symbol for the architectural expression of the freedom and the individuality exemplified by democratic societies. It's the architecture of democracy. And then last, there's psychological humanism, which is rejecting the cold, sterile, international style emphasis on functionalism and efficiency in favor of designs that attempt to fulfill psychological and emotional needs. It's the flip side of the origins of modernism, which was all very much tending to focus on functionalism, and even if it disregarded people, strangely enough. And now we've got a group of people who are saying, let's reset this, let's focus more on people and how they feel and how they experience buildings. And that's represented by Louis Mumford and Oliver Alto. And so if you look at these in general, what you see is a shift, where before World War II, humanism in architecture tends to mean either the empathy humanism or the bodybuilding humanism. After World War II, the psychological humanism becomes much more important. And so after going through that, I got a better understanding of where Yamasaki was coming from. And I went back to his goals, which don't really clarify it all that much, but there are inklings in here, or sprinklings throughout, of larger ideas. And I decided that he's in the psychological humanist group. Because if you look at this list, and it's kind of an interesting list, the first two are kind of vague aspirations, the last three are kind of technical design ideas, and the third is sort of a hybrid between the two. But thanks to the magic of PowerPoint, I picked out the key phrases and words, and we start to see things like beauty, delight, serenity, and that's when it clicked. Because Yamasaki's personal mantra, his catchphrase that he repeated and talked about in interviews and wrote about, was serenity, surprise, and delight. That was what he was trying to get out of architecture. And so I went back and looked at how he tried to impart those things, and it turns out that there's a connection. He is very much in that psychological humanist camp, where he's trying to reorient architecture to human beings and their experiences. So serenity shows up in things like the calm peacefulness of the courtyards, like at Mcgregor, Oberlin College, which is something that he learned from his travels, particularly in Japan. He talked very often about these places as refuges against the chaos of modern life. And he raved for the rest of his life about the serenity of the Taj Mahal and the serenity of the Japanese garden. And he felt it was particularly important as modern life accelerates and technology impresses upon us more and more. Surprise is very common in his work, and in fact, usually takes the form of a skylight. He loved skylights. He loved the idea of looking at a building and not expecting a skylight, then walking in and it all opens up to the sky, and it's an unexpected experience, and he thought that was a way to put a little bit of pleasure into a building, a little bit of fun, a little bit of, well, I'll leave it at that. But he did other things, like if you know the Yamasaki building at CCS, it's hidden behind this giant wall, so that's sort of a surprise when you get past the wall and see the building, which is nothing like the wall. Or in houses sometimes, he would have you come into what seemed to be an enclosed series of rooms, and then you turn a quarter, and then one wall opens up, floor to ceiling glass, and a beautiful view to the outside. And then delight. Delight is very difficult to try to pin down. He talked about ideas like the play of water and the contrast with the building, the correct manipulation of ornament, effects of light and shade, proper scale, elegant details, the silhouette against the sky. And in fact, one of the things that I found was that Yamasaki was really rare in that he regularly talked about beauty in architecture in the 1950s and 60s, when other architects were staying away from that phrase because it was still tainted by the 19th century and before. So in the end, I realized that what Yamasaki was talking about when he called himself an architectural humanist was this psychological humanism, this attempt to bring human ideas and feelings back into architecture at a time when it seemed to have been lost, at a time when it seemed like technology had overwhelmed modern design and put too much of an emphasis on functionalism and materials and structure and things like that. And in fact, his hero, Mies van der Rohe, didn't quite exhibit that. That's the one thing he felt that Mies lacked. For all his savvy with plans and structure, he felt that Mies lacked a human touch. And that was the one thing that would have made his architecture even better. So in the end, Yamasaki was participating in the creation of a new post-war definition of architectural humanism, one that merged an appreciation of architecture's psychological and emotional effects with a healthy dose of Cold War fear and anxiety, which resulted in buildings that attempted to make you feel good and happy. And this all kind of started, or it was all part of a larger post-war therapy session, I think, that spilled into the architectural world, an attempt to assuage people's anxieties about technology on the brink of disaster for the first time after World War I or II had created this untenable situation. So it begins as kind of a backlash against the cold sterileness of the international style, and then I think it takes on a little bit larger implications. For Yamasaki and others, the move took the form of introducing human beings back into architecture. And so even though he fell from favor pretty drastically and pretty quickly after the 1970s, what my project does with the book and the lectures and articles to follow is to stimulate a reconsideration of his work on its own merits, and not to think about the prejudices that labeled him as a decorator back in the 1950s, or that saw his architecture as sort of flimsy and silly and not very deep or theoretical in the 1970s or 1980s. I think that his attempt to humanize architecture by creating pleasant and peaceful and beautiful environments was a noble attempt that is appropriate for any architect of any era. So, thank you. Are there any questions? Eric Ward.
Are there any student questions?
I'm supposed to give you that, so I've done my job. Oh, okay, good.
I was kind of a curious, funny question. Will your books be discounted to students?
Okay, next question.
Next. You know what? Now that you mention it, I think that we were originally intending to have some books for sale here, but it didn't work out. But I think they have order forms that you can fill out, and I've been told that there's like a 25% discount if you use one of those order forms. So.
And also, LTU bookstore like that.
And okay, good. LTU's bookstore will match that as well. So. It's a wonderful Christmas present, holiday present, birthday present, gift for your in-laws and loved ones, doorstopper. You know, it's got great images in it too.
Do we have any other student questions? If not, I'll let the faculty have at it.
Oh man, come on, students.
I'll start, and then a student can show me up with a much better question. So you said you did some the research that you did. You found some lectures that you gave in a sort of an industry setting. Did you discover anything? Did you do any teaching, and did you do any lectures in an academic setting? And did the academy also reject him? Is this part of his policy?
That's a good question. Not at first. I mean, when he was riding high and achieving his highest fame, he was on the circuit. He showed up as a guest critic. He gave lectures at colleges. He was awarded honorary degrees by schools. He also designed a lot of college buildings, which I didn't get into, but he was known early in his career, before he started to get famous, kind of as a school designer. And he was really well regarded as a school designer. Won some awards and probably could have just done that for the rest of his life, but he had higher aspirations, I think. But he did a campus plan for Carleton College in Minnesota and designed a number of buildings there. He designed a campus for a university in Canada and did a couple buildings there. He did buildings at Oberlin, he did buildings at Harvard, 2 buildings at Harvard, 2 buildings at Princeton, building at Butler, and probably something else I'm forgetting. So he was involved with academia as a designer, and he was on the lecture circuit. About as well as the one that I showed you. I mean, that's the best statement that I found of him trying to explain what he's getting at. And it's not exactly the best. Yes, next.
I don't need the mic, really. So his partner, Helmuth, did he go on to be Helmuth and HOK?
Yes. Yeah, when they split in, oh boy, I could look it up. I think it's 56. They, Lineweber and Yamasaki formed their own firm in Detroit, and Helmuth took a lot of the designers from the St. Louis office and started HOK. So HOK stands for Helmuth, Obama, and Helmuth, Obata, and Kassebaum. And Helmuth is the Helmuth, who I talked about, and Obata was Yamasaki's chief right-hand man before the firm split. So he kind of received the Yamasaki training. And I think in his early work in particular, there's a lot of Yamasaki. You study it. But yeah, HOK is Helmuth.
I had one more question too. Did you realize that you taught history backwards today? At least for a little while. Like about 10 minutes.
Maybe. I wouldn't admit it though. That's an in-joke between Ralph and I that's been going on for years. Yes, Paul.
I don't need my question. Do you need it recorded? First of all, as a University of Washington graduate, I think you had an excellent choice. That institution has produced some brilliant minds. My question might be slightly unfair, but I was really intrigued on that relationship between the global family of man version of humanism and Vince Scully's sort of democratic humanism. And even though he seems sort of like a one-off, I do wonder if that global family of man is still a Western discourse at the time, and to what extent, like, for example, humanism gets evoked in Soviet thought or in Soviet architecture, because, of course, that's a heavily debated term in the whole Marxist tradition. So it might be unfair because I recognize the nature of this project,
Sure.
but it was just something that came to mind. I was curious about.
Yeah, it's very much a Western concept. And now I just forgot what I was going to say. Oh, and so yes. And then the other thing that spurred me when you said that is Scully being a one-off with his notion of this strange architecture of democracy, right? That too became very common. It's a lot of architects talked about the architecture of democracy. I even had some quotes that I cut out of this at the last minute, where Yamasaki sort of merges, and this is one of the reasons why I was confused at first. I thought maybe he was part of this democratic humanism as well, because he threw out the term democracy all the time. But once I started to really think about what he was saying and learn more about his designs and his goals, it was more lip service, I think, than anything else. I think it was kind of standard for architects in the 50s and early 60s to use democracy whenever possible. And it was part of this larger cultural project to promote America. You know, this is the Cold War. We're facing off against the Soviet Union, and they're the godless communists, right? Well, we're this free society that produces fantastic pieces of art and music and architecture, and it's only because we have this sort of freedom. So I think he used the phrase quite a bit, actually, but Yamasaki never meant it the way Scully did, and I'm not sure anybody really did. Cody, student first.
So what really interested me during the lecture was the power of the critic in his fall, Yamasaki's fall from the light. Is there anything today, or is there anybody today that holds that same kind of authority or power down to a point where there's no longer?
That's a great question. And
I guess, kind of water.
And that may be the topic of a future article that I may write. You are very astute in ascertaining the role of the critic back then. They were very, very important, very powerful. Like, Scully was an artist or an architectural historian like me. He taught at Yale, but he was very influential, and he could almost make or break careers based upon what he said. He also was engaged in trying to direct architecture in certain ways. Which I don't do, and I don't know any other people who teach these days who undertake that role. But what's happened in general is that almost every week, it seems, I see indications that a critic of some sort has lost their job. And lately it's been music critics, but that's because the architecture critics have already lost their jobs. There's only a handful of them left, really. Seriously, like Mark Lamster in Dallas, I think, for the newspaper, and Christopher Hawthorne, Blair Kamen in Chicago is allied with the Tribune still, luckily. But it used to be like Ada Louise Huxtable had even more power than Scully. And she definitely made or broke careers. And she's in part responsible, I think, for Yamasaki's downfall. I mean, I think it would have happened anyway because he would have been seen as outdated eventually. But the way she turned on him, she had championed him for years. Even though she kind of was always a little ambivalent. She always sort of held back and said, he does beautiful buildings, nobody can debate that, but maybe there's an aspect that, you know, he could do differently. It was never 100% full praise for him. But she did praise him and promote him. And she praised the first World Trade Center designs, thought they were wonderful and amazing, as did other critics at the time. And then when the second one came out, she slammed it and never gave up. And one of the stories that I tell in the book is, it really got kind of sad, I think, because like 10 years later, Yamasaki was still trying to convince her about the World Trade Center. He drafted a letter that was about 20 pages long, which he co-wrote with his engineers to try to explain what was going on in the building, because he felt like if she would understand the technological marvel that these buildings were, that she'd appreciate it. And she understood what the technological innovations were. She just felt like it was way over scale and that he had compromised the principles that had made him famous in the first place. And so she never let up. And so she started criticizing him in '66. And I think their last correspondence is in the late '70s. And he writes this really long, well, at that point, he wrote her a letter where he introduced something else. It was like, hey, there's this interesting project in Detroit that you should take a look at. And by the way, going back to the World Trade Center, and she responds with a card, just a note, and says, we're always going to not see eye to eye on this. I respect you as an architect. I love your work, but I think this project just didn't do it. And she closed down the conversation after that. But it really hurt him because you know, she was the leading architectural critic in the country at the time, and she had promoted him, and they had a pretty close relationship, and then he felt that she betrayed him, and that started a lot of problems for him. But in general, architecture criticism is almost dead in terms of the influence of architects or on architecture, because so many newspapers have discontinued or fired their critics, and now it's spreading to other fields like music and art, and it's becoming everybody's own opinion on your blog. We don't feel like we need experts to give us guidance anymore, I think, which is a very large topic that we don't have time to get into. Follow up, though.
On a lighter note,
okay.
Didn't Prince Charles from England fancy himself as a...
Yeah. Prince Charles, when was that, in the 80s? He came out and started to talk about the ugliness of British architecture, modern architecture in particular, and he wanted a resurgence of classical historicism, and he drew a lot of flack for that. Yeah. Did you have a follow-up, Cody?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, to follow up on that, do you think that the lack of the like esteemed or power of the critic is causing a distilling of, or not a distilling, but like a less refined level of architecture today?
I don't know, because on the one hand, I think there's an argument that we don't really need those critics like we used to because there's so much more exposure. You know, back then there were a few architecture journals, and you would get coverage maybe of the important projects in the newspaper, and that was about it. And now, you know, you could spend 24 hours a day, 7 days a week just reading about and looking at buildings. It's everywhere. So we don't need them to orient us to architecture in the same way, but I think we still need their critical voice. And I think that the architecture profession still needs their critical voice to keep it in line, or to, well, I guess I'll leave it at that. Paul.
You mentioned critical voice. What to you would define that critical voice? Does that come from us as architects, or does that come from like the colleagues around us, like, or is that like our own interpretation? Yeah.
Personally, I think it's the responsibility of everybody in architecture, or related with architecture, to, you know, evaluate architecture, to think about where it's going, where it should go, what it's doing right, what it's doing wrong, and not just leave it to experts, whether that's somebody writing in a newspaper or somebody who publishes books or a famous architect. I think it's essential as a field or as a discipline that everybody is involved in the critical engagement and trying to move it forward and trying to improve it. Jinfeng.
I overheard you talking with other people about the houses, you know, he designed. And then I wonder if any of the houses has any historical significance. So that's in your book or somewhere?
Yeah, it's in the book. Well, I talk in the early part of the book. I talk about some houses pretty in depth, because in the early to mid 50s, as he's becoming famous, I think there's kind of an equal balance between larger public projects and business commissions and houses. But he made a conscious decision after about 1955 or 56 to drop schools and to drop houses and focus more on architecture that could affect more people, he said. He also said that he didn't like the idea of somebody coming in off the street and just asking him to design a building. So he never advertised, his offices never had the Yamasaki name on the outside. And he also didn't like the meddling. He felt like when you get a business client that commissions a skyscraper, you know, they pretty much let you go. But somebody's house, they're always in it. They're always asking to change this and that, and he didn't want them looking over his shoulder. But I do talk about a few houses in the 50s, and then he designed his own house in the 1970s, which I think is pretty interesting, and it's pretty much a return to his Misesian roots. It's kind of a merger of Misesian simplicity and Japanese architecture a little bit. But he pretty much gave up houses after the mid-50s and refused to do them, which is unfortunate, because I think he did some really interesting designs. Are you guys going to go at it here?
So quite literally down the street between 16 Mile and 18 Mile, Arrow was wrestling with corporate modernism at the exact same time, and what to do with the modern American rationalized corporation on the model of technology in a certain sort of way. Was there any ever dialogue between? There was. Okay.
Absolutely. Eero Saarinen and Yamasaki were friends. Yamasaki lived not very far from where Saarinen's office was located, up in Birmingham, or north of Birmingham. And they had a really good relationship, to the point where, you know, there's a famous story that with the London Embassy competition, that they both reached the final round. Just before they submitted their initial entries, the story is that Saarinen decided to play a joke on Yamasaki. And apparently Yamasaki they both worked all the time, and they stayed up all night working and had terrible hours. And so Yamasaki would show up at Saarinen's office at like 1 a.m. and just to, you know, talk about things and see what was going on, and likewise. And so the story is they decided to work up a version of Saarinen's entry to the London Embassy competition that was like an exact copy of Yamasaki's. And so Yamasaki pops up one night and they go, hey, check out our entry into the London Embassy competition. And Yamasaki's like, whoa! It was essentially his own, slightly changed, and it freaked him out. And then they all laughed. And so they had a really good relationship. But in terms of, like, I keep talking about future articles, maybe I'll get to or not, I think there's a real healthy competition between those two guys. And I've started to chart similarities in buildings. Like the St. Louis airport comes virtually the same time, slightly after Saarinen starts to design the Kresge Auditorium at MIT, and they're both thin-shelled concrete vaults, the first two really in the country. There's a couple other instances where Yamasaki does something and then Saarinen follows up with something that is a little bit similar. And I think, and of course I can't find any evidence of this in correspondence, and neither of those guys are around anymore, but I think they were playing off of each other, intentionally trying to one-up each other in a friendly kind of competition.
So the follow-up to that is when Yamasaki pivots off of Wayne State buildings onto corporate America, onto the consolidated gas tower, he's tackling a new building type, the skyscraper, and also a new organization type and client type, the corporate state, in some sort of way. Would that have an impact on the definition of humanism or how he tried to deal with it? He maps a different animal entirely onto
That was my question.
State that again. I lost track. I started thinking, honestly, in the first part, I started thinking about something else, and then you turned on me.
He pivots off of Wayne State,
yes.
Okay, and a smaller scale campus environment to the gas tower, a large corporate client.
Yeah.
And Arrow's wrestling with the corporate client too.
Right.
That pivot from one building type to the other, one client type to the other, and the mapping of humanism and the place of the individual with respect to the corporation.
Do you think, how did it affect him? How does it hold up? Well, and I think the World Trade Center is the best example of how it doesn't hold up in some cases. And it's a fascinating story. In fact, if you're really interested, I'm going to lecture a week from today at Wayne State in the Mcgregor building, specifically on the World Trade Center. But what happens there is, you know, the most interesting aspect of the World Trade Center for me was the plaza. Because in the first iterations of the plaza, there are trees all over the place. There's a moat around the edge of the plaza. And it's a real kind of pleasant environment that's intended to kind of offset the massiveness of the buildings. And there was no going back on the size of the buildings. He either would have had to quit or he had to make them that big. So he was stuck with it. So in the first iterations, I think he tempered the building a little bit by trying to make the plaza a human kind of place. In the end, it turned out not to be that way. In the end, it's this windswept place that, I don't know if you ever went there when it was I gotta go all the way back. It was a terrible, I missed it, didn't I? There it is. Is there any people in that photo? Well, I doubt it. A couple of things happened. On the one hand, budget. He was under a lot of pressure. And an easy cut was to trim down the plaza. Not trim it down in size, but to empty it out of all things. Now he ended up with the sculpture in the middle, and there's some sculptures around the edges. But it's a big, empty, windswept place, which was not very human at all. His argument was, well, the way he justified it, and I don't know if he ever really believed it, but this is what he started to tell people, was that when the buildings are that big, there's nothing you can do at ground level to make them any better. And he said, frankly, plus when you're in a city like New York, you know, all the buildings are big, so everybody should be used to a larger scale. But he felt he started to downplay the plaza when I think in the early days that was really the emphasis, where he felt that he could bring some of his older principles in to humanize it a little bit. The other thing that hurt the World Trade Center was that you didn't enter the buildings through that plaza. People entered the buildings below that level. There was a whole world down there of shops and train stations, and almost everybody who worked in the World Trade Center came in subterraneously and took an elevator up. So there was no traffic. Yeah, there was a mall under the ground, and so there wasn't really any need, particularly once you got up there and it was windy and it was cold and there was these, I mean, if you wanted to get a good view of the buildings, sure, but for some people it was a frightening experience to have these big buildings looming over you.
So was the critic right then, that he abandoned his principles?
Yeah, I think she was. I think she was, yeah.
Did the execs
Yeah.
And parks and basketball courts.
Absolutely. He envisioned Pruitt having a river of green through it, as he called it, which was landscaping, grass. In some early iterations, there's even some water in there. That left really early. But it was going to be like a park. It was the Corbusier idea of the tower in the park. And the government and the budget that they had for those projects was just bare bones. And so they cleaned all that out, as well as shrinking the size of the rooms, and it ended up hiring the cheapest contractor. And once the buildings were built, the maintenance budget was zero, so they weren't kept up. And there's a lot of problems with those housing projects. But it was the same thing in that this time it wasn't his decision, though. He was forced to. But he might have been forced in the World Trade Center a little bit, too. But I think the way that he justified it later was to say it wasn't all that important. And I don't really believe that. But I really think that's the apex of his career, and everything starts to go down after that. His health goes down. His personal life goes down, and his popularity diminishes significantly. After the World Trade Center, I can't think of one building that was published in an architectural journal. Whereas through the 50s and 60s, he was on the list of most represented architects in the top 5 consistently. They loved his work. Yeah, Mark?
I want to make a remark first about architecture critics and then get back to these ideas about humanism. It seems to me that I'm not so surprised, given the rise of online journalism, that we don't see architecture critics appearing in papers or having that power. What is a shame, what does bother me, is that architecture critics have been dropped from the architecture press. For example, 12, 15 years ago, Architectural Record was regularly publishing, in every issue, at least 2 of these 3 critics, Michael Sorkin, Martin Filler, and Bob Campbell, all of which they're great writers and great thinkers, and they're dropped. And that's a problem. What do we have now? Well, Aaron Betsky is like the Betty Crocker of architecture, But I want to get back to the idea about humanism. If I've read the Time Magazine article from the early 60s, 62 on Yamasaki, and Louis Kahn gets a paragraph in it, like, oh, there's this other guy, right? And their fortunes, their reputations have now completely reversed. Mm-hmm. What I'm seeing is that as you get into the 60s, Yamasaki's idea his wish for humanism and architecture only increases. But architecture goes in a completely different direction. Mm-hmm. And I want you to tell me why.
Come back in 10 years after I write another book, and then I'll have a good answer for you. Why does humanism seem to disappear after the 60s?
Physical forms.
Well, let me put it this way. What I've just finished teaching my students in 20th century architecture is that after the 60s, there's a real disillusionment with the idea that architects can change the world and make it a better place. The failed utopianism of things like Pruitt-Igoe, it was seen as a disaster and an architectural disaster. It was poorly, and you get people like Oscar Newman writing about how it could have been designed better and it could have worked better if they'd have done it the right way. That begins to play a part in it. The sort of disillusionment in general in the architectural world with big ideas and with world-changing ideas, where they tend to focus, we talk about, in my class I talk about postmodernism in terms of the populists and the elites, and the populists like Robert Venturi look backwards. They turn inwards in a way to look back at architecture's own history, whereas the elites like Peter Eisenman argue for this autonomous architecture that excludes everything except form. And there's nothing else, materials don't matter, psychology doesn't matter, nothing matters except the object itself. And those are 2 orientations that really don't take into account human experience and human psychology and emotions. And I think it was just a trend of the field. It maybe was played out by the 1970s, in the same way that by the 70s, Yamasaki's earlier work was seen as sort of ridiculous and over-decorated. And it had its moment, but that moment had passed. Just like modernism usurped the historical styles of the 19th century, their day was done. So the generation of Yamasaki's architects in the 50s and 60s, by the 70s, they were seen as ridiculous.
Is it seen as inauthentic in some way?
Inauthentic because
humanism persists, right?
In architecture? I'm not sure about that. You know, this is when Peter Eisman starts writing about post-humanism, for instance, and that all those old ideas, including the whole Renaissance notion, are over with, and you know, we don't need to deal with that anymore. But that's a longer conversation. But I think that, oh, I lost it again. In terms of just the passing of time and fads and things like that, one of the things that he was seen as Yamasaki was seen as ridiculous because he focused on ornament, but he didn't really. I mean, if we think of ornament, I don't see ornament in his buildings, but he was criticized for being a decorator and an ornamentalist. He was also criticized because he was not a theorist and didn't really get into theory. And I think the idea of designing for people and trying to create beauty in architecture by the 70s, nobody's really into that anymore. They're looking at other things. And I think part of it is this disillusionment from the failed promise of the earlier generations that didn't seem to come to fruition. Modern architecture didn't change the world, didn't make it a better place, and a lot of attempts seem to have failed dramatically. At least that was the mindset in the 70s.
Well, I have to set up it there because I think there's a class. After this,
Whoops.
I'd like to thank Dr. Gyure, and I'm sure he'll take your questions down here. Thank you very much.
I sent an email to John Gallagher hoping I would get to come tonight. And in view of the discussion of architecture criticism,